Hi, everybody. How is it going? I'm Rob. I'm Rob Lee. I do a podcast called The Truth in This Art. And the podcast explores sort of the intersection of art, culture, and community. And I've been doing it for the past 5 years. And this podcast came about because a former president said something very spicy about my city. And I'll get to my city in a moment. And that pursuit of disproving that sentiment led to me connecting with some folks in arts and comics and in media, and actually kind of brought me here. I interviewed a dude named C.M. Campbell, Craig Campbell, and he invited me here, and that's how it all kind of came together. And we're here today for this panel with this great group of guests we'll introduce in a moment, processing our modern world through comics and activism. So back to my city. I am from Baltimore. I see a few faces. Looks a little weird. It's not The Wire. Everything is safe. We're all good here. But that sentiment of The Wire and having that really deep connection to it, being from there, I think that's always the story. And I think media plays a big role in sort of what the story is of certain cities, certain communities. And what I wanted to do was disprove that idea of this is what this city is, this is what this group of people is. And that was my attempt at like activism, like when that commentary, and believe the commentary was, Baltimore is just a city filled with rats. It's kind of a weird take for a city in the, in the US. So within like a few days, I was like, let's reach out to folks I know in the city, artists. That's a good cross section. I started doing some interviews. Let's get an idea of what does Baltimore look like to them? What is their world about? And that led to me kind of like extending the idea of whose work matters, whose story matter. And it led to me reaching outside of Baltimore into other communities and with other artists, and that's how this whole thing came to be. So I want to, cover a few things about Baltimore before I introduce my lovely panelists here. People always hear about, The Wire, right? Baltimore actually had the first railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Had the Peel, the first museum art building, and the first museum of African American history in the U.S., the National Great Blacks and Wax Museum. So when folks are talking about all the negatives and that's sort of the export about a place, a lot of times people don't go to those places. Crime, negative stories, sort of the media plays a role in it. So I don't know, just my attempt at activism, and in 5 years and in nearly 800 episodes, that's what my intent has been and continues to be, and again, what led me here to be a part and moderate this great panel. So also, before I got into podcasting, which I've been doing for about 15 years, I wanted to be a comic artist. I was a failed artist. It didn't work out. But I approached it as a writer now, so I do actually have a comic that's kind of going right now. But I've always had a love and an admiration for it and seeing sort of some of the storytelling opportunities. So when the opportunity presented itself to be here, for one, just to be around sort of the community and see the artists and visit a new city, I jumped on it, and then being asked to moderate a panel, it's like, hell yeah, let's do it. What are we doing? So, I'm just really, really fortunate to be here and, have this conversation. So I have 3 guests to my left. To my left, we have Nate Powell, award-winning cartoonist, illustrator of March Trilogy. That's right. Next, we have Ben Passmore. Comic artist, political cartoonist. Credits include Your Black Friend and Sports is Hell. And to the far end, you guys switched seats again, didn't you? No, you didn't. I got it wrong here.
You look similar, though.
Yeah.
It's good. We have Cole Pauls. Credits include Dakwäkãda Warriors and Pizza Punks.
Yeah, and Kwändŭr.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I got some awards too, though. to clarify.
Please share.
I would like to be, no, I just was going to say it for the joke. I'm not narcissistic enough to mention it. I got an Eisner. I got a...
Keep going.
I got an Ignaz Award.
I thought you were going to pull one out for a second.
No, that'd be great.
I always got that thing
If
on.
I just had it, when I did get the Eisner, I was like, this is gonna make certain people mad, and I should just wear it as a necklace, like around me. So that's still in the works.
Yeah, it was one instance where a couple years back, when doing sort of a different setup, I'm usually at home with the monitor and all of that, and I was trying to get over a new nickname for myself.
Right.
That I gave myself.
Oh, okay.
Which you're not supposed to
No,
do.
you're not supposed to.
It doesn't
do
work.
that. Yeah.
I came with a jersey that had a nickname on it, and it was not good. It was Wave Daddy because I'm an Aquarius.
Okay.
So that's what I wore to get myself over to a group of people.
You
Yes.
wore a Wave Daddy jersey?
Yes.
What was the group of people?
People like this.
I don't think these people are buying Wave Daddy.
No, they're not. They're absolutely not. That's the point.
Daddy is tough. Daddy is tough to convince unless you're in certain circumstances. You know what I mean? You needed to come here with like a vest with no shirt on under, and then people probably would have bought Wave Daddy.
That's tomorrow's fit. That's tomorrow's fit.
Okay.
So the way I like to do sort of these conversations and sort of these interviews and panels is to go to like an earlier point. So I'm going to go through my slides. Yeah, I got slides. It's not just a static picture up there.
That's a great slide.
Yeah. So what was the first cartoon comic that really resonated with you? We can start with you, Nate.
Okay, the first one that actually made a ripple in my consciousness, I think, because like I went from getting into comics through like Wonder Woman, the Hulk, Spider-Man being on TV at the same time when I was a little kid, then G.I. Joe, Transformers. It was 1986, The Nom #1, edited by Larry Hama, written by Doug Murray, and growing up in like a multi-generational military family as a G.I. Joe kid in the Reagan era. The existence of this book, which had an entirely different premise from anything I was digging from the writer's experiences being a drafted teenager in Vietnam, and each month was following 1 month in a tour of duty of other drafted teenagers starting in 1964 in Vietnam. And so much of it was structured around, so it was sort of like the anti-G.I. Joe, obviously, but, it was really giving space for the long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of intense sheer terror. Yeah. And it really magnified what it meant to be a teenager in these circumstances at the time. That single comic book, I read like the first year of it, but issue #1 instigated so many conversations with my dad where finally you could tell, like, he was like, thank God, I'm ready to talk about this stuff. And really like helped finally put some cracks in the facade of like my G.I. Joe kid, Reagan era misconceptions around what my dad experienced in military service and like the larger sort of like nationalist myth as a whole. So the Nom #1, that's my pick.
Thank you.
Damn. I don't have an answer that good. I was trying to think. My first, other than like Calvin and Hobbes and like Garfield, I think the first comic that really like made me want to draw was nothing overtly political, although you could probably write a dissertation on it, at least like my experience with it. So I had a babysitter who was who was black and also a nerd. And, like growing up, he stood out from like the other folks, in my family or my community because he was also a nerd. And he passed me these Spawn comics. And I was like, oh, I fucking love this because his brother, he's in the dark. He's like covered in spikes and chains. I love spikes and chains.
Who doesn't?
And then, pause. But And I read it, and I always had it, and I assumed as a child that because it wasn't the internet like that back then, I assumed Todd McFarlane was black, because why else would the character be black, right? And then I found out later, I was like, this is a white man. Right. So, so there's an analysis to have, that I found. But I love Spawn, you know what I mean? I think like overtly political comics that really resonated with me later was after, when I was a teenager, I was institutionalized for like 4.5, 5 years. And when I got out, I still liked comics, but I wasn't interested in the fantasy comics anymore. So I got involved, or I got into comics like you would find in like the World War III magazine, because this is post 9/11, and Peter Cooper's work like really resonated with me. Seth Bachman's work really resonated with me, like particularly his like comics about like New York squat, like people fighting evictions and stuff. Yeah. And it, as at a time, locked up for 5 years as a teenager, like I went in as a teenager and came out, like kind of a young adult. And like one of the things is like trying to reacclimate to the world, right? And so those comics really helped me sort of like understand like both like sort of how the system actually works, right? Because like you get institutionalized for a long time, particularly as a child, like you're just hyper focused on trying to figure out how like the system you know what I mean, that controls you works, right? So I didn't know nothing about the world. So all those comics like both gave me an analysis about how things actually worked, right? And then also like how folks like me who feel deeply alienated by it, like can find sort of like locate action and power within it. So that's my answer.
Thank you. I thought you were going to say something about your position on Mondays changed because of Garfield. I thought that's what you were going to go with in a long way.
Okay, that's a funny answer. Let's run it back. Let's run it back.
I was just thinking how you're a liar, because that was a very thoughtful answer.
Thank you. I didn't have it at first.
Okay, so for me, growing up in the Yukon, I had a babysitter, same vibe sort of thing, where he was the son of my art school, like my art teacher in elementary school. So I always looked up to him. I was like, oh, your mom's cool, so you must be cool too. And I invited him to like my like 6th birthday party, because I was like, you're so cool, I need to invite you, you're an older teenager. And he gave me Yukon Ho, like the Calvin Hobbes collection. Hey. And yeah, right? And I was just like at that perfect age where I was like, oh, this is me. Like, this is my community. This is the Yukon being represented in a comic. Like, I finally found myself in the world. Like, I grew up being told I'm in a very small community that's way up in the north that nobody knows about, but Calvin and Hobbes know about me, So yesterday, part of my Billy Ireland tour, I got to see the Yukon Ho song original, like lyrics or whatever. Oh, wow. I was not allowed to take a photo. Apparently the song is copywritten, so you cannot take a photo of the original art. But I got to spend like 10 minutes with it yesterday, and I just like stared at it and like shed one tear. It's just like, oh my God. Felt very full circle to like get invited here and then be like, what's your choice? And I'm like, obviously I need to see the Yukon Ho lyrics, right?
Good.
Anyway, so I did it.
That's great.
Thank you. Thank all of you. I'm going to move into this next question I have, and it's related here. This episode kind of stuck out. This is an episode of Family Guy, and it's sort of the what role does humor play in your work when addressing serious or like controversial topics? And this episode sticks out because I believe this was the episode where it's like Brian and maybe Stewie, and Brian reveals that he wanted to, as the young people say, unalive himself. And I think it was kind of clever using the baby and the dog, who they're not adults, they shouldn't be talking, having this like conversation or what have you. So how do you address, sort of those topics, those serious topics, maybe with a dash of humor or satire within your work?
I'd say my approach is similar for like Save It for Later, which is like the only thing I've done that even remotely approaches memoir, but is also nonfiction, or some of like Fall Through, most recent fiction thing, but a lot of it pulls from touring a lot in punk bands and being part of punk as a creative community. In general, it works best for me and worked most acutely in Save It for Later when I recognize that I have a lot of room for lateral movement and a lot of leeway in my work if I allow my own character, like in Save It for Later, to be wrong. Even if like a lot of this involves experiences with my family, raising young kids between 2015 and 2020, equipping them at their level with what they need to process this rapidly shifting authoritarian hellscape.
Right.
So a lot of that is also parents making mistakes or having, it's a lot of it's intergenerational. It has to do with, reflecting on your own parents making weird baby boomer assumptions, and then catching yourself making parallel assumptions in the 21st century as you're trying to undo the mistakes your parents made. And so that means that my wife, and I can't not say it like that. I've tried. But when Rachel and I, we each stumble as parents, but I recognized as the cartoonist telling this story that is unavoidably wrapped up in my entire family unit, how do I make that feel ethical? Like my kids can't consent. So at the time, that's why I made them these weird, anthropomorphized deer, fox, dog creatures, unicorn creatures. But then this other part is my wife and I are a team working out all this stuff together. She is the smarter, more balanced social worker of us. And I'm typically the more reactionary one. But I was okay, no matter who makes the mistake in these, it's funnier and better, and it goes over better if I'm always the idiot in this book. And so that worked very well, and especially because these weren't unique experiences. The reason I made it was because for a large cross-section of America, I noticed that people had already shut down the conversation about how 45's administration and this far-right power grab had affected the private parts of their lives and how it worked on a smaller level within their communities, their neighborhoods, their families. And so the book is a way to clear space. And in that way, these were not unique experiences. It was the breadth of the ways in which these things were already shut down by the end of 2017, as far as people talking about them openly. And the best way to kind of make people feel like they had the ability to be oh, we're going to dig into this shit again. We're still living it. Yeah. The best way was to be look at me. I'm the idiot for you in the pages.
Thank you.
So I was thinking about it, and when I was in college, it was it was one of the peaks of the Daily Show and Jon Stewart, really focusing on Fox News, and also just the Bush era. And then it seemed as I got old, and I felt inspired, I think, a lot by that kind of look at political topics. I think a lot of people, I even had a very terrible comic strip in my college newspaper that was heavily cribbed from that show that fortunately no one can see, because the internet wasn't what it is now, so you can't find it. Don't try. So I think so. There was that initial part, and then now there's I think there's a bigger economy around it. There's podcasts Behind the Bastards that I think is formally sort of similar, where you're oh, we're just here's all the facts about this deeply horrible but ridiculous person, and here we have this comedian who's sort of laughing and commenting. As a person who's reading about it. And I think initially, I think like a lot of people, felt this all seems less scary. And in fact, these people in power are in some ways humiliated by the fact that we're sort of revealing how hypocritical or ridiculous they are. But we're at a time now where Bush seems like a scholar in comparison to who's the head of the Republican Party now, and even Trump the first time around, he got ridiculed real bad, and it didn't matter, right? It turns out that the fascism is really, really resilient to humiliation, right? Because it's shameless, and also it's that's not actually, it turns out, how you like really fight fascism. Like I was really at a front row seat for a lot of, for when the alt-right came up, and was ultimately smashed because, in a large part, because they would do these college tours, and anti-fascists would show up and like hit them with hammers. And it turned out that that was actually a much more effective way to deal with fascists. So now I find myself cringing quite a bit at like the over-reliance on the sort of like the humor, you know, because now it's like it's like dispersed, right? Like Jon Stewart's back, and you know, like we even have like Last Week and Tonight. Like we have so much more like really prominent media, and I think it gets us in this thing where it's like we're feeling a lot of stress. We're like, if we're watching the news, we're watching a little bit, but it's like mostly on social media, and then we get sort of this release because we laugh at it, and then we think we've done something, you know? It's like one of the many different like sort of off-ramps to like radical action, which I would include like, you know, like charity industry, like, you know, just being like voting, that'll do it, you know, shit like that. So I think for me, you know, having made comics, you know, like, you know, political comics starting from that age in college to now, I still do them. I do a lot of nonfiction comics. I found myself feeling like pretty self-reflective about like my own contribution to that, you know. For me, I think not only because of the influence of the show, but also because I felt like I was a weak writer for just being straight serious. I was like, I'm not really good enough to just be, you know, deep. You know what I mean? I feel like I'm really good at almost being deep, and then here's a joke, and hey, that was funny. Jodie Foster reference. So I think for me, there's the influence, there's my own coping mechanisms that like my therapist is always talking about. She's always like, why are you laughing? And I was like, clearly to change the subject. But I think also so there's all that, and that sounds like I'm denigrating it. I think the one part that I do think is true. So I think the thing that doesn't work, that I think we get caught in, is thinking that laughter affects power, and I think that that's wrong. The thing that I do think that it does help internally, and it's something that I think a lot about when I was institutionalized, but even when I was in jail. I went to jail just for a couple hours, don't worry. I went to jail because I went to a protest. It was a Klan rally. I wasn't there as part of the Klan. I was there against the Klan. So I went with a whole bunch of people in black bloc, as the anarchists say, dressed like ninjas, to go have a really reasonable conversation with the Klan at the top of this mountain, and I got caught trying to have a conversation. And you know, I'm in jail, and you would, you know, as some people may know, jail is really, really boring, particularly booking. So you're just in there, and you're either going to fall asleep or you're going to make jokes with the people that are there when you're sort of like not getting legal advice from the oldest member of the cell. And like something that I really notice is like when you don't have control of your own autonomy, the best thing you can do is to show power that they haven't touched you, right? Because there's this thing, like, it's all over the world, but there's sort of this narrative we have in the United States that also is part of like the de-radicalization of our communities, is that like the most important thing is that you appeal to power, right? Like you don't have it, so you should appeal to them through dignity, respect, you know, appealing to emotions or whatever. Right. It's not how it works, right? That's what Kwame Ture said, right? It's like in order for it to work with power, they have to have a self-conscious. Power doesn't have it, or America doesn't have it. But internally, I find that it's like really, really important and bonding to sort of like, hey, shit is bad, we talking about it, but also like, listen, we're gonna be all right. You know what I mean? Like community. I think a lot of the resiliency, at least of the community that I come from, is that you got to take like your emotions, your internal life, like really, really seriously, but it's also, you got to laugh. You know what I mean? Like I remember during George Floyd and in Philly, there was 2 days of just out and out street fighting, like, you know, people burning cop cars. There was a tank on 52nd Street shooting gas canisters. I got shot in the back by a gas canister. trying to have a really important conversation with a police officer. And I remember I was downtown. It was a Rittenhouse neighborhood, this real bougie neighborhood, right? And after the fact, the news was like, oh, they were looting. But, and you know, like some people got some clothes in this economy, you know what I mean? Like, why wouldn't you? But something that was really, really important, it was really, really important that that particular neighborhood was the one hit, and they didn't hit any other neighborhood. They mostly focused on this really bougie neighborhood. It was for a reason. This is the seat of a certain kind of expression of hypercapitalism, white supremacy. Like the quote unquote looters would walk down the street and someone would try to hit like a local black business and people like, not that one, get the next one. Yeah. And the people would do it, right? But you know, it's like, that's not anyway, that all being said, you know, everything's on fire and there's smoke and people are like coughing, like it's the movie, like a grenade just went off and people are and I was just like pretending that I was the narrator for a trailer, being like, in a world. And sure, like that's stupid, but I mean, hey, we're in the middle of fighting, you know what I mean? I think it's okay for me to make a joke. So I think that's still my approach in comics, you know what I mean? Like I try not to undercut and pretend that like power is going to be affected by my jokes, but like part of like I think like marshaling courage is to be like, look, it's not that deep. Like no one's expecting you or I to be like movie level kinds of brave. Like we're faulty people. Like let's just like be human, and part of that is just kind of making some jokes, being a little funny.
Yeah. Thank you. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess like for my work, I feel like comedy and just indigenous culture kind of just go hand in hand. It's kind of what you said about being resilient and kind of losing all that shame. And then once you lose all that shame, it's like you can make fun of anything. And you know, the situation you're in, yourself, other people, you know. So I guess like my type of comedy now is, I guess I'll use my example would be like my Savage Skunk Bear shirt. So Marvel created this like origin story for Wolverine where he goes through the Rockies and he like saves a native village from a giant green worm. And there's a boy who gets attacked by a bear, goes blind, Wolverine saves him, brings him to the village. Then he gets introduced to an Indian princess where he falls in love with her, and then she gets killed in the comic. And then, of course, the chief, her father, is like, you must seek revenge for me now, right? So he goes out, kills the giant green worm, gets gifted this regalia, and then gets gifted the name Skunk Bear when he finishes the fight, right? And I read this comic, and I was like, this is so outrageous. It's only like a 48-page story. It's like almost progressive, but also really not progressive at the same time, you know? It's like one step forward, 3 steps back sort of deal. And when I read it, I was like, this is such an outrageous story. And then I learned that Marvel was reprinting it in like omnibus collections about like like Marvel or Wolverine's history or whatever. And I was like, oh, no one really knows about this comic. It's really stupid. How do I kind of like shed light to it and kind of make an example of it? Because there's so many other superhero stories that are like this, where they're just like, oh, for this flavor of the week, I'm native. Oh, for this flavor of the week, I'm, you know, in France or whatever. So I was like, I'll draw a white guy in red face on a t-shirt, and then how do I make it worse? I'll add savage to the title, right? You know, it's really funny for Native people. They think it's hilarious and they love it. And then anyone else is like, I'm really uncomfortable by this. I don't know if I'm allowed to laugh at this. I don't even know if I'm allowed to say what's on the shirt, you know? So I guess, you know, I just try and make fun of stuff when it's a tough situation. I'm like, let's just like really beat it down and like also put it on a pedestal to also show you how stupid it is at the same time, you know? Because when I put it up that high, people realize, oh, well, should I say savage? Oh, isn't Wolverine white? Why is he wearing regalia? Where's all, you know, it's like, it kind of starts this conversation, and most people don't know about the comic too, so I kind of have to explain, like, this is not my character. This is an actual Marvel story that Tim Truman wrote, the guy that did Scout. Anyway.
Wow. Thank you. I love when the comedy comes to sort of like these topics that are tough, that are hard. And, you know, early in doing my podcast, and, you know, for the first 10 years of me podcasting, I did a comedy podcast on like current events. And then in 2019, I started this one as literally a direct response to 45, right? And one of the earlier guests I had in sort of this arc of interviews was like the founder of this huge outside of art museum in Baltimore. And she was like, you know, I researched you before you did this. I was like, oh, did you? Finally, someone's checking me out. And she was just like, your interview style and your sort of sense of humor in your old podcast, it really comes through, that kind of get folks' attention. The whole gesture, if you want to get something across, you use the gesture to do it. And that stuck with me. And I like how comedy is used to really point out, you know, this is not right? This is pretty bad, right? This is stupid. So yeah, that's my take on that. I'm gonna move to this next question. And the cool thing is, some of my questions are already being answered, so I'm going to be able to skip ahead. You're making my job easier.
Okay, you're welcome.
Yeah. So it's this one. I thought was, you know, every time you get on social media, you hear like, oh, The Simpsons forecasted this. This was a thing that happened. Or is the world just getting weirder? You know, as far as like the world's becoming more satirical, or satire like The Simpsons just eerily prophetic? And, you know, you had the 45 thing in there. You had, I guess, Lisa supposed to be Hillary Clinton. I don't know. And Disney buying Fox. Those are things that's happened in sort of the arc of this show. But in the framework of what we're seeing now and how folks are pointing out, you know, social media and so on, that we've seen this before. They forecasted it. They were Nostradamus. What is your take as far as how the world is like shifting around us? Are we just getting stupider? Is it becoming something else?
I guess what I would weigh into this is centering the artists and the creators. No, this is where, like, if we're talking about the role of people doing storytelling in mass media and its impact on culture, and whether or not, like, yeah, this is the fork in the road. Is it cynicism, stupidity? Is it a crucial fruity blend of vitamins and minerals that has helped deliver us to this world by desensitizing us to it? But I think this is where, like, particularly if people are taking absurd leaps into the future, I don't see some of the lucky shots that The Simpsons has gotten as being that different from like a really weirdly prophetic like Philip K. Dick, or like mid-century sci-fi, or like Ursula K. Le Guin plotline that winds up simply being the world we live in. And I think perhaps because something like The Simpsons became so deeply embedded in our culture, and it's still available for all of us to have access to, as are books, I think that we have a fresh enough collective memory that it's easy enough for someone to actually be like, actually, I remember what episode that is, or I remember what issue of that comic that's in. And so, you know, I think it says more about the role that certain types of storytelling play in our broader cultural sense of self and what connects us. Yeah. And so it's more like it's a component of the shared language we use to decipher our world. But there is certainly more like desensitization and more cynicism that sort of makes us be like, well, like, not a surprise. But I think a lot of it really, like, I want to give some props to the people who are writing and drawing weird stuff that looks forward into, you know, what the most like off the wall possibilities could be, because they're still possibilities. And a lot of it is like storytellers. We take possibilities and we put them on the page or on the screen, and then we wait for our lucky shots, sometimes like in the worst possible way. But this is simply what we do.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. I guess I was thinking, because, you know, stuff with Eric Adams is happening right now. And he did the move that folks do. And it reminded me of, like, was the Huey saying, like, every brother that's locked up is not Nelson Mandela, you know?
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, some of it is just like, you know, stuff is like really, really cyclical. But it is interesting that, you know, for as many things that feel like sort of prophetic, it hasn't stopped any of the things from happening. You know what I mean? I don't know. Like, I feel really, really resistant to this idea that like the things are getting like more like out of pocket, I guess, as it like, because it's like, you know, things have always just sort of been wild. I mean, certain things like the circumstances around like just like the planet, right, is worse, is demonstrably worse. I do think a lot of times that like I remember being a kid in the 90s and listening to certain kinds of music, and just culturally it felt like there was a very natural culture of like resistance that was still sort of like everyone was plugged into, like go to people's houses and they sort of had like Afrocentric stuff, you know what I mean? And I think that is like been pretty lost, you know? Like I think in some ways the way that like The Simpsons, but also like, you know, I think a lot about like other shows like South Park. Let me think of comics since we're at a comic show. But there's a kind of storytelling that like is commentary that like our protagonists are at best sort of like unwitting agents in the progress of things developing, that I think has contributed sort of this idea of us like of course we feel powerless, right? Like we have basically no impact on what happens, even like in our city most of the time, you know what I mean? And of course, like to me, like the answer is like, okay, well, like that's because it was never with exceptions, right? It's basically never been possible for one individual person to like make sort of like massive impact against like empire, right? But we have like a lot of media that's sort of like saying like, oh, is it so funny that you're like unwittingly like the trigger for all of this stuff, right? When in fact, like that's not really true. Like we're all basically irrelevant in the scheme of things. Yeah. So what is my point? I think that it's interesting because like sort of this conversation about things being more satirical, I think is often sort of spoken in this way that it's like really like, oh, like it's really doomy, like I'm feeling really disempowered. And I think that that's true, but I think there's also sort of comforting to sort of try to frame our actual lives in that way. Yeah. Like, you know, like watching, I don't know, like I did a series called Dakwäkãda that was like a post-apocalyptic, like everything is fucked kind of thing. And I think that like format is really fun, right? Yeah. Because I think in a lot of ways, it maybe feels relieving to be functioning in a world where like there's not really consequences because everything's already kind of fucked, right? You know what I mean? It's like it's just sort of like setting a house on fire that's already fallen down. So I don't know. So I think it's one of these things that it's like it's a kind of power fantasy that I don't think we're yet willing to admit is a power fantasy. Because there's maybe like a bit of guilt or whatever. But yeah, I don't, you know, like The Simpsons, the obvious answer for The Simpsons, like predicting things is that they had to make so many fucking shows that you're going, you know, it's the monkeys and the typewriter. Like you're just gonna, you know what I mean? You're gonna hit the button. You know what I mean? You're gonna get it. And shout out to them for continuing to have work, I guess. Yeah.
It's good.
I'm just curious, like, what were all the Simpsons predictions that were true?
I don't fucking remember. Sorry, I don't remember.
The Trump one is one of them, I guess, right?
There is a bunch of them.
Yeah.
I remember watching The Simpsons. I heard it got good again. Is that true? It got good again? Oh, we're too artsy to watch The Simpsons? What are we watching? Okay. All right. Okay. I know y'all watching trash TV at some point.
Well, I can move into this sort of next question. You touched on South Park a moment ago. So
okay.
Sure.
Sort of in your view, how's the role of like the cartoonist, the storyteller? How's that changed in sort of this fast paced, like almost social media? It's like you got to get it out there almost as quickly, and sometimes these topics, these current events, they're ever changing. It's like, I want to have this out there. I have a really fun and witty and interesting take, but also the story is developing. What are your thoughts on that in the scope of like how maybe you're doing your work, sort of the attention and the timeliness towards some of the work that you're doing in this fast-paced system? And really, I'm thinking over like the last 5 years.
Right.
I have a very quick answer to this, which is simply that comics take a long time to do, and I'm like a book-length comics person. That's my jam. But yes, especially in the last 5 years, even though through social media we are all the product, we are not the consumers. We are the product, and so keeping that in mind, finally I saw the power. In terms of like being somebody who takes 2.5 or 3 years to do a book, where all of a sudden you're like, oh, strangely, I'm in a highly specific situation where because I can write and draw, I can be affected by something and sit down for one day. And yeah, sort of going back into the fact, like I'm confronting my objective powerlessness in the scheme of things. However, the ability to at least, while still being in a reactive state, work out my thoughts and yes, react online in the space of 24 hours.
Sure.
And there have been moments really ever since this comic About Face that's in this book came out and oddly became my most read comic of all time, but no one wanted to publish it from the corporate publishing world. And thankfully a new indie website was like, yes, we will put it up for you. There is a definite sense of hunger, and it sort of was reassuring in terms of like, yes, cartoonists, like from the outside world on the other side of the screen, cartoonists being like, thank you for actually being able to take what I'm thinking about, what I'm worried about, and yes, simply taking words and images and using your comics magic to have it make sense in a way where like, this articulates what has been burning in my head this whole time. But it's the fact that as a long form artist, you're like, oh, there is potential in being able to spit something out in 24 hours and having it actually reach people who feel the same way or see the same thing, and they simply don't have the chops to be able to be like, here it is filtered into this way that actually contributes in some way to the conversation, even if it doesn't push the needle.
Yeah. I would definitely agree with that. Like I think the things, like I do a lot of like 4 to 6 panel comics. I used to work for the Nib, which like I would do 4 to 6 panel comics monthly usually about something in the news or responding. Like I always like doing like little short, sort of like there was a kid in Baltimore who was one of the squeegee kids, so-called squeegee kids, that a white dude came out of his car with a bat. He shot him with, I guess a gun was illegal or what. I mean, he was like 14 or whatever. But so I wrote about that and sort of like the wider context or whatever. And that was a story that I assume was like big in Baltimore. It was big in the news for a second nationally. And so I did it again, and there was a bunch of people who never heard about it before. But it's like so many things, it intersects, right? Like these local stories are hyper relevant to where they are, but it's a conversation. It's like they cover so many things sort of about us. So I feel like even though the news cycle is really, really fast, and some of that has to do with just the way that things have been politically more recently, and just also like the way that people get news on social media, right? Like the way that it's constructed, it's like there has to be like this thing. And as someone who likes, like after the Nib closed, I tried to keep it going with the news thing. I was doing this series on public camping because the Supreme Court was deciding whether or not fining houseless people like upwards $500 for sleeping outside was unconstitutional. You know what I mean? And they found that actually it's fine. So great. But also the think tank sort of around, like pushing towards like a special kind of criminalization of public camping that would basically make it so cities couldn't take government funds if they didn't punish people sleeping outside. And the big think tank pushing that was connected to Peter Thiel, who everyone knows, I'm sure. He's Darth Vader. But one of his connections is he's the CEO of Palantir. It's an AI company, and they're helping the IDF track people, and also is connected to border stuff. So I was like, oh, you know what I mean? This is a little seemingly like little story. Sure. Is actually really, really big. And the problem though is like, as you said, comics take for fucking ever, right? And research takes its own time. So I would research, right? And then I would write, but it's got to all fit in 4 to 6 panels, which is basically nothing. If you don't draw comics, that's nothing. You know what I mean? And then I was working on it, and then Trump got shot at. And it's like, well, that's funny. I need to write about that. You know what I mean? And then some other shit happened. So it's definitely difficult. And I think I'm learning that like maybe I should listen to just the reality that comics doesn't take a long time. But also it's like the business of comics is just really difficult, right? Because it's like I can't, I sold the book to a publisher in 2020 because there were riots, and they were like, we really want to get on the right side of this. Who's a black angry person we can give money to? That's how a lot of us got money, you know what I mean? And right now they're not worried about us, so please riot if you're black so I can get another book deal. But until that happens, you know what I mean, it may not even be much of an option for me to do a long form thing, you know what I mean? So a lot of the economy of comics is really difficult. And I feel grateful that comics is relevant at all, personally, that anyone continues to give a shit. Yeah. You know what I mean? But I think it is difficult. I think a lot of cartoonists who are trying to figure out, like how we're engaging with social media, which is just fundamentally like aggressive towards an art form that does take time and takes thought, is really, really difficult.
Stuff. Cool.
I refuse to conform to social media. So I post like twice a month, and you're lucky if it's twice a month, you know? Like, I don't know. I'm 31 years old. I refuse to download TikTok, you know? So if anyone's older than that and on TikTok, that's on you, I guess.
It's great.
Are we both on TikTok?
I'm on.
Oh, okay.
I see it through my wife's phone occasionally.
Right.
I'll get my daily updates or whatever, but I'm like,
Yeah.
I just can't step into that world.
I just
look from afar.
yeah. So like, I feel like my immediacy is like when I'm done. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And some of the stuff I'm doing, no one else is really trying to do or even research into. Like I have a zine, Indigeneity Comics. It came out in 2018. I've been doing research since then. I'm gonna do future issues that are more themed to genres and like nations and communities. But there's almost no one else reviewing Indigenous comics in a critical, positive way. You know, like if I handed an Indigenous comic to someone who wasn't Indigenous, they'd go, "Oh, it's really pretty, and I like this and this and about it," but they wouldn't say, "Oh, this is incorrect," because I know it's incorrect, you know? So I'm one of the few people that like pays attention to those things. And like you said, research takes a long time. Yeah. And so I feel like I make the book and it's done when it's done, and then it's a printed book. I refuse to post it online. Like I've done 4 books now, and I've maybe posted like 10 pages of the interiors, because I want you to buy the book and read it as a book. Like when I went to art school, I'd always get critiqued for my my line work drawings on the wall, and they'd be like, "Well, this artwork doesn't look finished," and I'd be like, "Well, the finished artwork is the book itself." So I want you to buy the book and read the book. And I've had people like from India message me and be like, "I can't afford shipping. Can you sell me it as a PDF?" And yeah, sure, I'll sell you my PDF from me. But I don't want to have my PDF online. I want you to read the book. I want you to pick up the book. So I don't know. I don't conform to any of that. And I think that's maybe why my books sell so well, is because I'm not catering to the comics community. I'm catering to just like readers, you know? And I don't know.
I love
do
that.
it my way.
I love that. So that's pretty much most of the conversation I have for you guys. Thank you for the insight. Thank you for being on this panel. I think we got maybe a second for one really quick question right there.
It feels like in a lot of political art today that audiences are looking for confirmation bias more than something that challenges their assertions about the world. Do you find it challenging to introduce nuance into the political aspects of your work?
I'd say yes, but I feel that in different degrees, and it's something that has accelerated, whether it's like really getting a first sense of that, working on certain components in like March Book 3, and having like these regular conversations with the late great Congressman Lewis and with Andrew, trying to make sure that certain components were included, which cut against the entire accepted current of like the hierarchical narrative of the civil rights movement. But then then to take it to like this summer or something. My most recent comic published is just a 6-panel comic that Matt Bors, who now does like comics editing for In These Times. It was like I live in southern Indiana, so it's basically like the general theme was like we're looking for a comic about any signs of progressive movement in the Midwest. And my problem was simply that I couldn't find any. And this was in July. This was like early July when I had this comic to make, and I was like, oh shit. And I was like, I have to lean into the fact that I don't see any signs of progressive movement. And it was a real dark time there in like early July or whatever. Basically I had to lean into that and look for these other bright spots. But even like little moments like, things I had seen first person in terms of like dealing with snipers on the roof of IU in my town, against like pro-Palestinian encampments, and then the next day going to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and on the way out of town, passing real deal Nazis on the street with very carefully worded, ambiguous signage meant to suck in idealistic and young pro-Palestinian college students. And the delicacy to cover that tension in one panel was like, as I was doing it, I was like, I think I nailed it, but I am so nervous about this, I'm not even going to mention that I published this comic. So it's existed, it's like been in, and it took 2 months to print. And going back one question to like the high pace of everything online in particular, I was like, 70% of people are no longer thinking about the sniper on the roof to begin with. And I was like, it took 2 months. I just have to let the comic exist. I can't even weigh in on it. The comic has to do the work itself.
Well, thank you.
That's fine.
And thank you all for being here. Give a round of applause to the panelists, please. And thank you all for coming out, and enjoy the rest of CXC.